We are very fortunate to have with us Professor Christopher Roberts. Christopher is presently with Australia-India Institute, just completing his 5-week attachment. As you're aware, he is Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales at the Australian Defence Force Academy. As he just told me, this academy provides training to higher echelons of Australian defence services. And Christopher has done a lot of work on Asia Pacific, on China, on Southeast Asia. Today he'll be speaking on a subject which is extremely important. In some ways, one can say that how the Chinese are handling the issue of South China Sea, their behavior in respect of the contested territorial claims in both Parsons and Spratley's illustrates the larger story of the emergence of a more assertive China, which is willing to deploy its very considerable economic, political, military, diplomatic clout accumulated over the last 3 decades to pursue its interests. In this case, though the territorial claims are contested by several other countries, as Christopher will bring out, China has nevertheless decided to change facts on the ground or on the water in light of its own claims, despite the fact that the ruling of the international arbitration at The Hague last year in July went against China, which China categorically rejected. There is also this aspect of continuing ambiguity about Chinese claim. How exactly do you define line-dash line? That aspect has been perhaps left deliberately ambiguous by China. This is something we can explore later. During a period of 2 years, beginning December 2013 until late 2015, China managed to bring about unprecedented reclamation of territory around 7 features claims in Spratley's. Total acreage involved was in excess of 3,000 acres as compared to total of 50 acres claimed by, augmented by, reclaimed by other parties. Not only that, it has constructed both civilian and military facilities on these augmented land features, including 3,000-meter long military airfield in Spratley's, in addition to one it already had in the Parsons at Woody Island, plus a whole lot of other facilities have been created. What is worth noting is that these changes China has brought about, in a way others are accommodating or adjusting to those changes, and that seems to be the assessment on Chinese side, that though it might be paying some cost in terms of diplomatic damage to its reputation, but what it's achieving through the changed facts perhaps is on the whole is a good trade-off. Now, what are implications for India, Australia, other countries? I think that's another aspect Professor Roberts will go into. Implications for India are sometimes inadequately appreciated back here. South China Sea is seen as something at some distance from us, disregarding the fact that 55% of our trade passes through South China Sea and Malacca Straits. Also, fact that our principal naval access points to Western Pacific and beyond go through South China Sea. Any major change in control, operational control in South China Sea will have very serious implications in terms of our Act's policy, apart from the implications for freedom of navigation in that important waterways. And one can even argue that what's happening in Doklam Plateau today is, in a way, part of a larger pattern in which the Chinese behavior in South China Sea is Exhibit A. I'll not go further on these issues. I just wanted to highlight some of the issues. I'll now invite Professor Christopher Roberts to make his presentation. After that, floor will open for discussion. Christopher. My apologies. I forgot to introduce Mr. Vinod Chandani of Australian Indian Institute, and I'll request him to speak first before we invite Christopher.
Thank you, Ambassador Kantha. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to this afternoon seminar. As you dive straight into China, I'll take you a little bit away from that into Australia. Briefly tell you a little bit about who the Australian Institute is, what is this program, and how Christopher fits into this, and of course I have the pleasure of introducing Christopher, but I will go keep that very brief. The Australia Indian Institute is based in New Delhi. It's a flagship program of the institute, aims to be an epicenter of research, dialogue and partnership between the two countries. With a center in Melbourne and a center in Delhi, we hope that we can bridge these gaps together. As a part of one of our flagship programs is what we have, the Incoming Leader program, of which we are extremely delighted to have Christopher, who's been with us for the last 5 weeks. The University of New South Wales is one of the founding partners of the Australia Indian Institute, along with the University of Melbourne and the La Trobe University. As a part of the program, our researchers come and live and work with us. For those of you who have had the opportunity to visit our office, or we welcome you to our center in Safdarjung Enclave. We have a 3-bedroom en-suite apartment where we offer a room and to live and a workspace to think and to work with us collaboratively on areas of priority for both countries. As a part of this program, it's been extremely delighted to have Christopher, and he spent more than 5 weeks in terms of the amount of work that he's done, but has been here for us. And as a part of his outcome of the program that he's visited India is to deliver a lecture, and we also have our Incoming Leader Fellows produce a paper, which is then published in a book which is lying in front of you called Samvad, which is the platform for dialogue research, which is the platform for writing and reflections, and we produce this publication biannually. So feel free to have a look at it on our website, or we will be producing hard copies as and when. Without further ado, I'd like to go into this afternoon's presentation, and I'd like to introduce Christopher Roberts, who I could spend the next half an hour talking about all the achievements that he's done. But essentially, Christopher A. Roberts is an associate professor at the University of New South Wales at ADSA, which is at the Australian Defence Force Academy campus, based in Canberra. So he's got 2 institutes, typically one institute with a host university. He has an extensive experience across the region, has lived in Singapore, in Japan, and worked across various aspects of it. And I just learned that he's writing his 5th book. So we've got an academician, a writer, a great person, and an expert in the field. I won't take away the thunder from your subject, but really delighted to have you with us, and we're really looking forward to hearing much more about your presentation. Chinese behavior and actions in South China Sea, implications for India, Australia, and the region. And I think we have a great audience from all these regions to hear you and learn more from your research. Thank you.
Before I hand over floor to Christopher, let me thank Australia Indian Institute for making this event possible, because they have been instrumental in bringing Professor Christopher Roberts to India and collaborating with us to hold this seminar this afternoon. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the partnership, and hopefully this is the start of many more.
Sure.
Well, thank you both for such wonderful introductions, and for what a wonderful lead-in as well in terms of setting the scene on the South China Sea. I'm deeply appreciative to the Australia India Institute and also the Institute of Chinese Studies for their efforts in coordinating and bringing this event to the fore today. just in case you're wondering, the picture with the one picture is a little bit more light-hearted. The other picture is actually a bilateral exercise conducted between India and the Singaporean navies. My presentation, as was alluded to, will have two parts. The first is a very brief overview synopsis of developments in the South China Sea, including the arbitral ruling. It's a complicated issue, not so much the arbitral ruling, but the overall dynamics in the South China Sea between the claimants, the linkage with ASEAN, the linkage with other powers, middle major powers. And then in the second half, loosely speaking, just moving on to the Australia-India dynamic, the dilemmas for our two countries, and also for like-minded states, which I'll define and talk more about later on. In terms of the kind of key historical junctures in regard to the South China Sea, of course, we go back to the Kuomintang, and in the late 40s, I think 47, etc. But in the multilateral sort of environment of responding to the South China Sea, the first statement by ASEAN was in 1992, and then a response to aeroplane surveillance photographs by the Philippines, which proved China was building an installation on Mischief Reef. There was the 1995 ASEAN Manila statement. At this point, ASEAN was able to come to a consensus. It's important to note that the ASEAN membership was smaller at that time. It was the original members plus Brunei. But nonetheless, the position that ASEAN took did impress countries such as Vietnam. And we actually see by 1995 Vietnam joining ASEAN as the 7th member, and Cambodia, Laos and Myanmar, although Cambodia was the last, joining, representing all of Southeast Asia, except for the later independent Timor-Leste. There were, I won't go through everything in immense detail. I mentioned ZOPFAN because there's a zone of peace, freedom and neutrality that also had quite significant detailed references to continental shelves and exclusive economic zones. So there are a number of developments and areas of proactiveness within ASEAN that Beijing at that time was concerned about. And we also saw by 1995, with the photography that had taken place, there had been a change in the relationship between the Philippines and the United States. So some believe that perhaps Beijing exploited that, and that's why we see the start of installations, etc., such as on Mischief Reef. But nonetheless, in the wake of ASEAN solidarity, we faced a situation where China took a kind of charm offensive, to quote one scholar, and changed tact, engaged in extensive diplomacy within ASEAN. Also showed many positive signals. For example, during the East Asian financial crisis of 97 to 98, it did not devalue its currency, which provided it greatly lessened the impact of that financial crisis for its Southeast Asian neighbours. So some of the early signs during this phase of Joshua Kalansk's term, the charm offensive, looked quite positive. On the other hand, the impact of the financial crisis and membership expansion meant an increased diversity of interests, an increased interlocked set of relationships, including strategic security with countries outside of Southeast Asia, and different historical backgrounds. I'm thinking here the Indochina countries, the linkage with socialism, etc., and even to some extent Myanmar there. See the formatting's somewhat changed in the shift from computers, but as we progressed into the 2000s, we had the Declaration of Conduct to the parties on the South China Sea in 2002, which is a compromise arrangement, and it flows from the type of issues I just mentioned. The goal was a binding code of conduct. In the end, the ASEAN states themselves couldn't agree on that. Malaysia was one of the countries that, in some respects, sided with China there. And we start to see countries enter into their own initiatives, such as the Philippines and later Vietnam in the joint marine seismic undertaking. But that fell apart when it was released into the public domain that the Gloria Arroyo administration had actually included in this joint seismic activity something like 30,000 square kilometers of maritime territory that China had not even included in its 8-9 line or various iterations. And there's a very strong domestic backlash. Given these developments and the perceived inability by China to leverage through ASEAN or leverage at a bilateral level, and there are many other nuances here, but we start to see a shift as we move towards, say, 2007. Media often talks about 2009, but we start to see, in reality from 2007, a more coercive approach that included the sinking of Vietnamese vessels, the coercive measures to force the abandonment of a trilateral consortium on oil extraction, and an emboldened China in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis, where Chinese scholars increasingly talked about a harmonious East civilization. So I'll just see if there's anything of particular importance at the bottom of this slide. In terms of the harmonious East civilization, it has linkages, I think, to the often spoken Middle Kingdom, the tributary relationships based on a kind of asymmetrical dependence. And there would be a sense of reciprocity, but that would be conditional upon other countries, the tributary states, interests not conflicting with the core national interests of China. Then reciprocity would end. It would appear as the vision, and certainly the empirical evidence since. As the years progress, there were continued negotiations on the idea, the goal of a code of conduct, but we have seen a continuous pattern of stalling tactics. The time is not right, blaming the positions of smaller countries in ASEAN, or alternatively, just as the Philippines turns to arbitration under the provisions of UNCLOS, then all of a sudden, again, indicating a willingness to move forward on a code of conduct. When ASEAN announces this, then pushing it down from the senior officials meeting level to much lower working group levels, where the individuals don't have the authority or capacity to agree or commit to anything. So again, a kind of stalling technique, but still it's been dangling a carrot. And we even see this year statements about progress on a framework agreement for the code of conduct. But in reality, we've not seen or heard, and certainly on the Indian side, during a meeting between India-ASEAN relations a couple of weeks ago, the issue from India was, well, can we not, at least at the track 2 level, have some indication as to what progress has been made? I suspect we're not actually really seeing anything much beyond the declaration of conduct on the parties of the South China Sea back in 2002, or the various statements and principles on the realization and implementation of the code of conduct that have been reached in previous years. Beyond the ASEAN dynamic, a new phase of further assertiveness to cutting of Vietnamese exploration cables. We've also seen harassment and expulsion of Vietnamese fishing crews, and also the Scarborough Shoal incident, which is 124 nautical miles from the Philippines mainland island of Luzon. In 2012, within ASEAN, perhaps one of the most notable events was the failure in the first time of ASEAN's history to come to a consensus over a joint communique. Now, The Economist claims that the Cambodian foreign minister frequently left the room and that consultations were taking place between Cambodia and China over the content. While it's difficult to prove, I did travel the next year to Phnom Penh, and the approach of some people in government was quite frank, and that was simply, well, a couple of things. We're a poor country. China gives us and provides us more than ASEAN does. Secondly, where was ASEAN during the outbreak of the Prey-Vihir dispute with Thailand? So they feel that other ASEAN countries did not reciprocate or stand up for them. Why should they stand up on rightly or wrongly, this is their thinking, on an issue that has no bearing on their own domestic, and so this also links to the lack of community, despite the declaration that ASEAN became a community in 2015. Just some brief comments on the Arbitral Tribunal ruling in 2016, July. It did exceed, I think, almost everyone's expectations in terms of scope. The court went further than any previous ruling in defining the regime of islands. What was an island, what was not an island. It made explicit comments on issues like mischief reef, which is, and a clarification here, as a low tide elevation, it is not, under any circumstances, appropriable by any country. So therefore, it cannot, it's not firstly an island, but secondly, it can't even hold a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. So among the many other things that I highlight there, the court in explicit language said that China had infringed on, he quote, the sovereign rights of the Philippines. And this also extends to other issues such as interference in fishing and petroleum activities, etc. It also directly rejected the argument of historic rights, which China had maintained. And I think the critical point here, and this extends to some extent with some meetings I held yesterday with the High Commission where there was some misperceptions, and that is that UNCLOS as an instrument, when it explicitly makes a statement such as past rights or on historical rights, then when you ratify that instrument, that supersedes any previous beliefs or rights that maybe China thought or other countries thought that they might have had. And that's, you know, a basic tenet of law at pretty much the global level. So, for example, to take the case study and what are the implications of this ruling and other rulings in the case of the HD 981 crisis in 2014, where the deep sea oil drilling rig was placed in the locations I highlight there. The key point here I want to make is that the courts have consistently, in other decisions, not the arbitral ruling last year, favoured the mainland. The land dominates the sea. So, and if you have, even if for the moment the northern features of the Paracel Islands, we take the hypothetical scenario that China has legitimate ownership of those islands, they will not acquire the same, if there's an overlapping exclusive economic zone from the mainland of Vietnam, the larger proportion of the competing economic zones will be granted to Vietnam. And a smaller, you cannot have, say, a 3 kilometre or 1 kilometre wide island get the same entitlement in terms of the exclusive economic zone as the mainland coast of a country. So on balance of law, if we apply decisions and legal decisions in Africa and elsewhere, it was actually clearly located within the exclusive economic zone of Vietnam, and therefore an infringement of, in the words of the arbitral ruling last year, the sovereign rights of Vietnam. So we can see here where we sit in terms of the overall map and claims and the 9-dash line. Now, an important point to make here is, at most, if hypothetically the features to which mischief reef is already off the table, we know that China has no right to that, but in terms of other features where it has undertaken artificial land reclamation, at most they can claim, because they've been determined not to be islands, at most they can claim a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Beyond that, everything that extends from the Philippines outwards 200 nautical miles is now clearly the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. Unfortunately, President Duterte took the approach that, on the one hand, quite rightly, America hadn't perhaps exercised its duty under the Mutual Defense Act to protect and deter and prevent the island construction. But on the other hand, he also underplayed the hand and the extent of his win. For example, now that we know the much of the exclusive economic zone out of the Philippines is clear, then based on just a legitimate justification that the Philippines lacks the capacity to unilaterally police the resources within the exclusive economic zone, they could have invited, as one example, coast guards from other countries to help in the exercise of the protection of what is now deemed to be its sovereign rights by a legally binding arbitral court under UNCLOS, which China has ratified and was never coerced or forced, and the 82 UNCLOS was made at a time when all countries had their own input into the final draft. So it's not something that is from a colonial period era or anything like that. It doesn't cover that baggage. But the challenge now is that we see countries in some or increasing divide. I put question marks because there's some, this is too black and white to put countries just in three. Some sit somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. But I would say that for the moment, the Philippines, Cambodia, and Brunei, having already signed a MOU on joint exploration with a Chinese-owned company, have bandwagoned with China. I have a question mark on Myanmar because Myanmar actually, despite perceptions to the contrary, the military have held deep suspicions because of the history of their relationship with the Chinese. But under Aung San Suu Kyi and with a change of relationships with America, Aung San Suu Kyi isn't so much conscious of that suspicion, and there's been a shift in the last few months. How far that goes, it's hard to tell. With regard to the balancing, the question mark on Indonesia concerns its historical non-aligned, the value placed on non-alignment, but China seems to not be able to help but keep infringing on its exclusive economic zone in regard to the Natuna Island, and given their equal emphasis on territorial integrity, we may continue to see a shifting or hardening of Indonesia's position. But nonetheless, and overall, before I move on to the two-country relationship, I would just like to suggest, based on my 20 years of travel through all the ASEAN countries and fieldwork and living in the region, that there is no ASEAN community. We saw at the Delhi Dialogue last week, even the ASEAN members, some of them talking about it was declared on 31 December 2015, therefore it is. A declaration does not make something actually exist. The external relationships of many of the ASEAN countries are more important than their internal relationships. The membership of ASEAN is based on purely geography, not interests, and as I've already alluded to, the interests are extremely diverse. Also, membership, the ASEAN decision-making system, the idea that we must still stick to consensus-based means lowest common denominator, and that has played directly into the inability of ASEAN to exercise, and we've seen again with the Philippines changing position, a weakening of ASEAN's position to the umbrage, to the dislike of some other ASEAN members in the ASEAN statements, summit statements, foreign minister statements, etc. I would suggest also the binding code of conduct is going to be unlikely despite what China has said. If a code of conduct comes into existence, it will have little, if any, reference to the dispute settlement mechanisms under the global system or global UN or ICJ, etc. And if anything, China would only agree because it would reinforce a new status quo, which is by that time in its favour. There is no feasible prospect of a united and effective position on controversial geostrategic positions, and this extends to its extramural, its broader institutions, and to some extent also IORA because of the number of member states there. Just to give you some empirical background, I was the first to undertake a region-wide set of surveys, one at the elite level, one at the grassroots level in 7 different languages. The only country not covered was Myanmar because I didn't want to write the life and times of an academic in Insen prison back in 2007. But I did survey expatriate workers, blue-collar workers in Singapore from Myanmar. This is the elite survey. It's just an indicator of perception, but 100 government officials, etc., and about 60% indicated that they did not trust their neighbours to be good neighbours. This is the 900-person odd sample from every capital city, but also 3 rural areas of 3 countries as a control. And it turned out there was very little significant difference between those different samples. You can see here some countries have extremely concerning levels of distrust. You can also see on the question of the risk of conflict within the next 20 years, a number of countries, some have significant areas of unsure, but only as low as 14% saying they don't see or envisage conflict. Other countries look much more positive. In terms of China's goal, I won't read out what, but if anyone is interested, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint by email, etc. But I just want to focus on the premises here that, that China believes that no major power will undertake or incur the cost to deter what it has done, and so far that's proven to be correct in terms of the size, scope of its artificial islands, its coercion, and also the militarization, subsequent militarization. In terms of the US, the problem for it is not only does it have economic imperatives and domestic politics, but it also has global military commitments. So often in Australia at least, we see analysts looking at China in terms of overall force, structure and power, and the US as overall force, structure and power. But in the specific context, China only needs to project in its immediate neighborhood. And so to this extent, it greatly equalizes. I'm not saying it is equal, but it somewhat equalizes or balances US power. According to US Rear Admiral Simon Cullen, China has already won the strategic competition in the South China Sea and will slowly strengthen its control mechanisms there in the coming years. That is arguable and disputable, but that's one important perception. This is a map I've put together myself, just showing countries in the green circles that are perhaps deemed as benign from Chinese perspectives. The orange are those that perhaps it's already through checkbook diplomacy. The option means number 2 is starting to get countries to be more in its favour. And then the areas where perhaps it might assess and or countries that it may assess that it needs to use more coercive, forceful measures. And perhaps this links to what we're seeing in Bhutan and the very disturbing events there. This is out of the IISS Strategic Outlook released last month. And you can see here the various Chinese facilities versus the Indian facilities, and it links to the string of pearls argument there. The yin and yang of Beijing's strategy, there's the two sides I call dual signalling, dual purpose, and also dual actions. We talk here about the peaceful rise on one hand, but then very coercive statements, often through state-owned media, such as the Global Times. And we've seen that in the context of India recently, where, for example, there has been talk of potentially, that Pakistan could call on, I quote unquote, a third country for assistance in regard to Kashmir. Now, these sort of statements could be very provocative for some people, and not just states, but also non-state actors, so terrorist incidents, etc. It's, the rhetoric we hear out of the Global Times, sanctioned by Beijing, is extremely disconcerting. I can't overemphasize that, and I know speaking to people in Canberra, they feel the same way in various government agencies. We have dual-purpose infrastructure such as roads, rail, and I've mentioned Bhutan. The undermining of the status quo, and this is where Ashok made the connection, which was very good. We seem to have a pattern. For example, Bhutan, I believe Bhutan and or India were involved in agreements not to change status quo, 1988, 1998, but given the strategic positioning of the road they intend to construct, this seems to be very clearly a change on status quo. Well, not only does UNCLOS also, which China has ratified, forbid change of status quo in disputed territories, China also negotiated and signed on to the Declaration of Conduct on the South parties of the South China Sea. And we also see, I think if we look back at the South China Sea 15 years from now, no one can argue that the status quo has been maintained through to today. Maybe if you look at a clock, it doesn't seem to change, but you look away and it does. And then also using Coast Guard vessels, etc., to confuse the rules of engagement to get away with things that perhaps against the US Navy would not tolerate if it was actually a naval vessel blocking or passing there in a hostile way. So in terms of India, Australia and other like-minded stabilizer states, as I like to call them, what this means is countries that support a stable rules-based and order and international law. And here my emphasis is purely in the international domain, so we don't fall into this trap about starting to say a democratic alliance or whatever. This means Singapore would be included in this. I would also add Vietnam would be included in this definition of countries. In terms of implications for such countries, Australia and India, We are seeing non-compliance with the legal foundations of a rules-based order, the undermining of stability. I mentioned the issue on Kashmir, an increased security dilemma by undermining international law. It's only under international law that states, regardless of power or size, are equal under the law. And this reduces security dilemmas, this reduces the need to divert funds towards modernisation of military, it reduces the risk of an arms race, etc. Under a more anarchical environment, should we allow a rules-based order to become destabilised, then we could see weakened economic growth, again because of these diversions, but also investor confidence and other reasons there. Now, in terms of the common values and interests, and I really do emphasise values, because often when countries don't have so much in common, they focus on interests, which is a way of just saying we have a common threat or something. But I believe that Australia and India has far more than that. There's the usual, the democratic values, but that shouldn't be underestimated. It does inform why, for example, India has the moral authority on issues like territorial disputes. Take, for example, Bangladesh. India is the major power here, and when the ICJ ruled against India, India accepted the ruling. It didn't, try to claim some exceptionalist excuse, etc. So India has a record of leadership on this front. We have cultural bonds. There are 500,000 people of Indian heritage, and that is rising quickly. An enormous amount of Indian students studying in Australia, and an increased number of Australian students through the reverse Colombo plan coming here also to India. I have two neighbours within the immediate 3 or 4 houses that are Indian. I have a doctor that is Indian. This is the common sort of new world that we live in Australia. I've mentioned the rules-based order. I don't think we need to go too much there, but I think both India and Australia are also moving in similar directions. I know Australia, I know even on the United States side of things that the US was concerned that Australia was being too soft, even as recently as November 2015, when a delegation was sent from Washington to the Russell Defence headquarters. However, we have seen a strengthening of position. The exercises and activities. The difference with our phone ops is we don't announce them publicly. There was a BBC, for example, intercept, I don't know if that was deliberately leaked, of our planes going past the islands, the Chinese warning our planes, our Air Force off. We have also a toughening of the position of the leadership. There was an article recently saying our foreign policy is increasingly being led by defence, not DFAT. One can argue whether that's correct or not, but certainly within defence and within key intelligence agencies to whom I've had the opportunity to talk with, there is a significant proportion of resources are focused on developments concerning China, and not just the South China Sea, issues like our regular cyber attacks that we face that are linked and traced back to China. Interestingly, in an article from Panda Hugger to China Hawk by The Economist in reference to Prime Minister Turnbull, I was at the Shangri-La Dialogue, and he stated, and it shows how the regular intelligence briefings, etc., has shifted his position dramatically in the last 2 years to be perhaps even more in line with India's own concerns in developments, and that is, he said, we must preserve the rules-based structure. This means cooperation, not unilateral actions to seize or create territory or militarise disputed areas. This means not winning through corruption, interference or coercion. He in fact referred to the word China 13 times in his speech. That, if you look at that and you compare it with Secretary Martyrs, it was Turnbull who gave the stronger, harder speech, and that was a significant transition from his historical position on China. Now, there are challenges for both our countries in terms of being more active, starting with Australia. There is, and I even hear it here in Delhi, a perceived economic dependence on China. Well, it is an actual dependence, but the perception is, how does that affect Australia's position? It would be intolerable, I believe, for the Australian government or for the Australian people to sacrifice our values and long-term friendship with the United States, even though we raise questions, or many sectors do, about its actions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. But to sacrifice the relationship or to bend to assertive, coercive or military aggression against sovereign nations that unprovoked in our neighbourhood, that is in the Indo-Pacific. There has been talk about China corrupting certain politicians, and there was an ABC report which even detailed raids by ASIO to this effect. However, I think, like here in Delhi, speaking about foreign contact rules and regulations, our agencies are virtually impenetrable, in the sense that I've seen firsthand when an ambassador has come for a dinner for a farewell for a government course, and a captain from the Australian Navy has said she's embarrassed, but she has to fill out a foreign contact officer form. So emails, phone calls, everything is monitored in that sense. So I think Australia was somewhat naive, but we see a toughening of its position on what China is doing and the South China Sea. The other problem has been inconsistent positions by Australia. For example, in 2007, having the good fortune to be a part of the Malabar exercises, and then in 2008, the way and without consultation that they were cancelled and Australia withdrew. I think that from Australia's end, it needs to make further outreach to India and make a commitment that is unambiguous and long-term, and that is bipartisan, and demonstrate the bipartisan support to work with India both bilaterally and also multilaterally. 5 prime ministers in 5 years was a very bad time, and some of those were some of our worst leaders from my position, my perspective, in many decades. The diversification of Australian economic and strategic linkages is, however, something real. We need to build greater resilience in regard to the, at one point, 41% of merchandise trade being with China. That's now dropped into the 30-odd% range, something like 35, 36%. But that is still too much with one country. In the case of India, it has its history of non-alignment, and of course that informs perhaps some cautionary aspects with regard to multilateral engagements, and also, for example, some of the initiatives between states. There are also issues, of course, in the immediate neighbourhood domestically, and also with South Asia, such as with Pakistan, and these, of course, have naturally, absorb some attention and resources. But we see under Prime Minister Modi and India's agencies, a significant expansion of diplomacy beyond the immediate South Asia over the recent years. The Australian High Commission yesterday talked about, almost like a triple-fold increase in the number of defence activities, for example, in the last 2 years. So the need to reinforce strategic and political linkages is also there in terms of India's engagement with various ASEAN countries, also perhaps with Australia. Australia needs to do that vice versa. I attended a dialogue between Vietnam and India, and while there is strong strategic political, the trade level is still quite low. So moving to the last couple of, or 2 slides here, my argument is that neither India or Australia or any country really on its own can unilaterally deter, my emphasis is deter, to prevent China to continue down the path that has been going down without the support of other stabiliser countries. So again, returning to the Malabar exercise, if Australia can provide the right commitments, the right diplomacy, and not just in regard to Malabar but to other areas, I think it would be great to look at the Quad. I believe Singapore was also part of the exercises in 2007. This would most effectively balance Beijing's rising naval power. It has a number of benefits. One is outlined there in terms of splitting Chinese resources potentially, or at least its concerns, not just in the South China Sea but to the Indian Ocean. And there, just like with the US at the global level, it faces a dilemma and the costs of being as assertive in the South China Sea. But once it completes that, the problem and the risk is, does it then move to the Indian Ocean? Does it then move to the Bay of Bengal? Or is the next step in its focus East China Sea? But at some point it's going to come to all those areas that it perceives as vulnerability, and the best way for it to do this is one by one. And the best way for it to do this is to resist multilateral cooperation by dividing other countries, and so far it is successfully managing to appeal to the concerns of China's influence and power. The other areas, so we have the military exercises, and there's already trilateral dialogues, etc. But I would also suggest, and I discussed this with Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, I noticed he also raised this at the Delhi dialogue, is the idea for there to be, in some shape or form, a structured dialogue between the stabiliser countries. Now this could be done, and this is an early, I would welcome your own comments, an early idea, a nascent formulation at the track 1.5 level, which would enable academic think tanks, etc., to take a role in a way that desensitizes at least the first meeting. Perhaps those think tanks could formulate points of consensus in a public report to follow. Maybe there can be a workshop between governments at the end of the event with the idea of what are the areas where we all have a concern. UNCLOS, law, rules-based order, and a statement that is several countries or more that talks about law being binding, for example. Membership, I outlined there commonality, which is the idea of a stabiliser state. The short-term potential would be minimal, but the idea is that this may organically grow, that once you get past the first meeting or two, that perhaps it can lead to even broader cooperation, collaboration, and statements of issues of mutual concern. And of course this will be far more feasible than any other institution that exists in the Indo-Pacific, because the membership, the starting point is that everyone is abiding, those that are part of it, participating in it, abiding by international law. So finally, it's only, I think, through a multi-tiered defence cooperation, but also diplomatic dialogue, and a whole series of bilaterals and other means, that there is any hope of changing Beijing's calculus. So far it has achieved much of what is achieved with virtually little cost. Nonetheless, multilateral responses undermine Beijing's capacity to target one country by the very fact that they're multilateral. When we do see countries attempt to bilaterally punish others, China with Japan over rare earth minerals, that backfired. We now see that they've lost their monopoly on rare earth mineral exports. Australia, for example, has invested heavily in mining in Malaysia for this purpose. We also see that Sukarno, President Sukarno in Indonesia, when he launched confrontasi against Malaysia and Singapore, that became more costly to his own economy than it did to the target economies in an interdependent world. I can't overemphasize the dangerous precedents set for law and order, not just the South China Sea, not what's just happening in other parts of the Indo-Pacific, but also Crimea and also the Ukraine and the weak Western response there. Perhaps China was encouraged by what it saw firstly in Crimea. So I really conclude on a rather controversial note that I believe that the only decision left is when, not if, effective action will be taken, but that the costs of effective action will increase significantly, if not exponentially, the longer we come to the point of realising what is ahead of us. Thank you very much.